The air smells of wet steel and scorched timber. Dawn has not yet broken, but the horizon flickers with amber light, not from the sun, but from the burning skeleton of what was once the Rhine railway bridge. German engineers stand on the eastern bank, arms crossed, watching the black water churn beneath twisted girders that took 3 months to design and 6 weeks to build. It took American bombers 11 minutes to destroy it. Across the river, through the morning fog, comes a sound the Germans do not yet understand. Not the grinding of tank treads, not the thunder of artillery. Something rhythmic, metallic, the clang of steel on steel, methodical and unceasing, like the heartbeat of some vast industrial creature that has swallowed the war whole and now exhales it in prefabricated pieces. By nightfall, the Americans will have a bridge where the Germans see only wreckage and mud. In the winter of 1944, as Allied forces pressed toward the Rhine, the German High Command clung to a doctrine forged in the fires of the previous war. The doctrine was simple: rivers are walls. Throughout the First World War, the great waterways of Europe, the Meuse, the Marne, the Somme, had swallowed offensives whole, turning advances into stalemates, victories into bloodbaths. A destroyed bridge, the Wehrmacht believed, was worth a division of men. Let the Americans come to the water's edge, let them drown in it. German military engineers, the Pioneer, were among the finest in the world. Trained in the rigorous traditions of Prussian engineering academies, they built with precision and permanence. Their bridges were marvels of calculation, stress loads measured to the kilogram, supports anchored in bedrock, every beam a testament to the mathematical perfection of German industry. When they destroyed a bridge, they did so with equal care, planting charges in exact locations to ensure that reconstruction would require months of labor, thousands of tons of material, and the kind of institutional patience that modern armies racing against time and weather could not afford. The Americans, the Germans believed, would break themselves against the rivers of the Reich. This belief was not born of arrogance alone. German intelligence had studied American engineering capabilities in the years before the war. They had read reports from attachés in Washington and New York, men who toured American factories and returned with notes of curiosity rather than alarm. Yes, the Americans built quickly. Yes, their industries were vast, but their structures lacked the elegance of European design, crude, improvised, temporary. American bridges, one German engineer wrote in a 1938 technical journal, were built like children's toys, assembled from standardized parts with little regard for the art of engineering. When the Wehrmacht demolished the bridges of France and Belgium in 1940, they did so with quiet satisfaction, knowing that rebuilding would cripple any pursuit. When they repeated the tactic in Italy, in the Low Countries, in Poland, the strategy held. Rivers slowed offensives to crawls, armies stacked up on western banks, waiting for pontoons and ferries, bleeding men and momentum. By the time the Allies reached Germany's western frontier, the Germans had destroyed every bridge across every river from the Channel to the Alps. They had done so with the confidence of men who knew that behind them the homeland was laced with water, the Ruhr, the Rhine, the Elbe, each a natural fortress that would buy time, that would bleed the enemy dry. What they did not know is that the Americans had already solved the problem of rivers. The men of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers did not look like soldiers. They looked like factory workers, which many of them were. Farm hands from Iowa, steel workers from Pittsburgh, mechanics from Detroit. They did not march with the polished precision of German pioneers. They moved with the loose, efficient rhythm of assembly lines, their hands scarred not by parade ground drills, but by wrenches and welding torches. They chewed gum. They smoked Lucky Strikes. They called their officers by first names when the brass wasn't listening. The Germans, watching them through field glasses from fortified positions across the Ruhr, laughed. "Look at them," one Oberleutnant remarked to his staff as American engineers began unloading equipment on the riverbank near Jülich. "They bring toys to a war." The toys were Bailey bridges. Designed by the British engineer Donald Bailey in 1940, the Bailey Bridge was a revolution disguised as simplicity. It was not a bridge in the traditional sense, it was a kit. Prefabricated steel panels, each weighing 600 pounds, slotted together with pins and bolts. No welding, no rivets, no cranes. A trained crew could assemble a Bailey bridge using only hand tools and muscle. The panels were interchangeable, stackable, endlessly modular. Need a longer span? Add more panels. Need more strength? Stack them double or triple. A bridge that could carry a Sherman tank could be built in hours by men who had never seen a blueprint. The Americans had taken the Bailey design and done what Americans do. They mass-produced it. Factories in Pennsylvania and Ohio stamped out panels by the thousands, shipping them across the Atlantic in Liberty ships, stacking them in depots in France and Belgium like stacks of lumber. By the time the Allies reached the German border, there were enough Bailey Bridge components in the supply chain to span every river in Europe twice over. But the Germans did not know this. They saw the panels being unloaded, clumsy, repetitive, identical, and they saw confirmation of their prejudice. American engineering was crude. It would fail under fire. It would collapse under the weight of tanks. It would buy the Wehrmacht time. On January 17, 1945, the first Bailey Bridge across the Ruhr began to take shape.
The German artillery opened fire at dawn. Shells screamed over the water, impacting the western bank in geysers of mud and shrapnel. The American engineers did not stop working. They dragged panels into position, bolted them together, moved with the calm urgency of men who had done this 100 times before. When a shell landed close enough to knock a man off his feet, his crew pulled him up and kept building. Medics worked in the open, bandaging wounds without pausing to take cover. The rhythm of construction never broke. A German forward observer, watching through binoculars, reported back to his battery commander, "They are still building. Direct hit. They are still building." The Bailey Bridge rose from the riverbank like something growing, organic and inevitable. Panel by panel, the structure extended over the water, supported by temporary pontoons that the engineers floated into place with a speed that defied the German understanding of logistics. There were no delays for materials, no waiting for specialized equipment. Every piece was identical, interchangeable, and already at hand. By noon, the Bailey Bridge was halfway across the river. The German artillery fire intensified. Mortars joined the barrage. Machine gun nests on the eastern bank opened up, raking the construction site with tracer fire. The Americans brought up smoke generators, shrouding the bridge in chemical fog. They worked blind, by touch and memory, hands finding bolt holes in the dark. When the smoke cleared, the bridge had advanced another 20 meters. A pioneer captain standing in a bunker on the eastern slope stared in disbelief. "This is not possible," he said aloud. "Where are the cranes? Where are the engineers with the calculations?" There were no cranes. There were no calculations. There were only men with wrenches and a system designed not for elegance, but for speed. By nightfall, the Bailey Bridge was complete. 78 meters long, capable of bearing 30 tons, built in 14 hours under continuous fire. At 2100 hours, the first American tank rolled across, its treads clanging on the steel deck, and the German artillery fell silent, not because the guns had been destroyed, but because the men firing them could no longer believe what they were seeing. The Ruhr crossing was not an anomaly, it was a preview. In the weeks that followed, American engineers repeated the feat again and again at crossings the Germans had deemed impassable. At Düren, where the Wehrmacht had blown every bridge and mined the approaches, the Americans built 3 Bailey bridges in 2 days.
At Linnich, under direct observation from German tanks, they assembled a bridge in 11 hours. At Jülich, they built a bridge, watched the Germans destroy it with demolition charges, and rebuilt it before dawn. The speed was inhuman. The persistence was mechanical. To the Germans, it felt less like warfare and more like being overrun by a factory that had learned to shoot back. German field reports from this period carry a tone of bewilderment. "The enemy does not wait for rivers to fall," one report noted. "He does not maneuver, he simply builds." Another, written by a German engineering officer retreating toward the Rhine, described the American engineers as less concerned with our fire than with their schedules. This was not far from the truth. American engineering battalions operated on timetables drawn up weeks in advance, synchronized with infantry and armor movements. If the plan called for a bridge at 1400 hours, the bridge would be ready at 1400 hours. If the Germans destroyed it, another would be ready by 1600 hours. The expectation was not perfection, it was inevitability. The Germans, by contrast, had no answer. Their own engineers, trained in the careful craft of permanent construction, could not adapt to the American pace. A German pioneer unit might spend days surveying a site, calculating loads, preparing foundations. The Americans simply unloaded panels and started building. When a German engineer protested that a particular span was too long, that the banks were too soft, that the current was too fast, the American reply was always the same: build it anyway, and if it fails, build another. This was not recklessness, it was a different philosophy of war, born not from military academies, but from the sprawling, improvisational pragmatism of American industry. In Detroit, if an assembly line broke down, you did not stop production, you rerouted the work. In Pittsburgh, if a furnace failed, you lit another. The men building Bailey bridges across German rivers carried this ethos in their bones. Problems were not obstacles, they were inefficiencies to be overcome through speed, redundancy, and sheer material abundance. The Germans had expected the Americans to fight like Europeans, cautiously, methodically, constrained by scarcity. Instead, they fought like Americans, wastefully, relentlessly, with an industrial base that treated bridges like ammunition and simply kept firing. Corporal Friedrich Meyer of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division led a letter to his wife in February 1945, shortly before his unit was captured near Dusseldorf. The letter was intercepted by Allied censors and later filed in the archives of the U.S. Army Historical Division. In it, Meyer described watching American engineers work. "We destroyed the bridge at dawn. By evening, it was as if the bridge had never been destroyed. I do not know how they do this. We fire on them and they do not stop. They do not take cover. They work as if the war does not exist. It is not bravery, it is something else. It is as if they have so many bridges that losing one does not matter. Emma, I think we are not fighting an army. We are fighting a machine that does not care how many pieces it loses because it has an infinite number of pieces." Meyer's letter captures something the German High Command was slow to acknowledge. The Americans had not simply outproduced Germany, they had reimagined the relationship between materiel and warfare. For the Wehrmacht, every bridge was precious, every piece of equipment carefully husbanded. Losses were catastrophic, not merely in tactical terms, but in existential ones. Germany could not replace what it lost. The Americans, by contrast, operated under an assumption of surplus. If a bridge was destroyed, build two. If a battalion of engineers took casualties, another was already en route. Scarcity was not a constraint, it was a problem that had already been solved in factories an ocean away. This abundance had a psychological weight that the Germans had not anticipated. To watch an enemy rebuild again and again without hesitation or delay was to confront the possibility that the war was not a contest of skill or courage, but of sheer grinding attrition, and that Germany was on the losing side of an equation it could not balance. The symbol of this abundance was not the Bailey Bridge itself, but the 6x6 truck. The Americans called them jimmies, 2.5-ton cargo trucks that flooded the battlefields of Europe by the tens of thousands. They carried everything: ammunition, rations, fuel, mail, and most importantly, bridge panels. A single 6x6 could haul enough Bailey components to span 20 meters. A convoy of them could deliver an entire bridge to the front in a single trip. German soldiers, accustomed to supply lines stretched thin by fuel shortages and partisan attacks, watched these convoys roll forward with a kind of horrified fascination. The trucks never stopped. They came in daylight, in darkness, under fire, through mud and snow. When one broke down, another took its place. When a convoy was bombed, a new one appeared within hours. To the Germans, the 6x6 became a symbol of everything they could not match: American mobility, American logistics, American indifference to loss. In prisoner interrogations conducted in early 1945, captured Wehrmacht soldiers repeatedly mentioned the trucks. We could destroy their tanks, but we could not stop the trucks. There were always more trucks. The trucks carried more than materiel. They carried the psychological message that the Americans could afford to lose and would simply bring more. In a war where German logistics had devolved into horse-drawn carts and bicycles, where fuel was rationed and ammunition hoarded, the sight of endless American convoys was a kind of propaganda in motion. It said, "We have so much that we do not count the cost." This was the silent language of abundance, and it spoke louder than any broadcast or leaflet. By March 1945, the American drive to the Rhine had become a race not against German resistance, but against the calendar. The goal was to seize a bridge intact before the Wehrmacht could destroy them all. On March 7th, men of the 9th Armored Division reached the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen and found it still standing. German demolition charges had failed. The Americans crossed in force, and the bridgehead became a legend.
But even as tanks poured across Remagen, American engineers were already building more bridges nearby. They did not trust the captured span to hold. They did not wait for orders. They simply started building, because that was what they did. Within 72 hours, there were 5 bridges across the Rhine at Remagen. The Ludendorff Bridge, damaged and overloaded, collapsed on March 17, killing 28 American engineers. By the time the wreckage settled into the river, 3 new Bailey bridges were already operational, and 2 more were under construction. The Germans, watching from the eastern hills, understood then what they had refused to believe in January: the rivers would not save them. The Americans would not be stopped by water or fire or the logic of scarcity. They would build until there was nothing left to cross, and then they would keep building. In April, as the war entered its final weeks, German civilians in the Ruhr Valley witnessed something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier: American engineers building bridges not for military use, but for civilian refugees. With combat units racing east toward Berlin, engineer battalions stayed behind to restore crossings over the Lippe, the Wupper, the Sieg. These were not Bailey bridges, temporary military structures, but repaired permanent spans, reinforced with American steel and reopened to foot traffic. A German woman named Else Koch, who kept a diary through the occupation, wrote of watching American soldiers work on the bridge at Hagen. The original bridge had been demolished by retreating SS units. The Americans rebuilt it in 3 days. They worked without speaking, she wrote. No officers shouting orders. They simply knew what to do. When it was finished, they did not celebrate. They moved to the next bridge.
I asked one of them, through a translator, why they worked so hard now that the war was ending. He said, "People need to cross. That is all. People need to cross." I think this is the American philosophy of everything. Coach's observation touches on something deeper than engineering. The Bailey bridges, the 6x6 trucks, the endless supply convoys, they were expressions of a particular world view, one in which problems existed to be solved, not endured. Rivers were not impassable, they were inconveniences. Destruction was not permanent, it was a delay. This was not mere optimism, it was a structural feature of a society built on expansion, on the assumption that resources were limitless and obstacles temporary. The Americans did not see the world as the Germans did, as a place of scarcity and struggle, where every gain came at the cost of someone else's loss. They saw it as a place to be reshaped, rebuilt, improved. The bridges were not symbols of military might, they were symbols of a belief that nothing had to stay broken. By May 1945, American engineers had built more than 1,100 bridges across Europe. They had spanned the Seine, the Loire, the Moselle, the Saar, the Rhine, the Elbe. They had built through winter storms and summer heat, under artillery fire and air raids, in daylight and darkness. The longest Bailey bridge they constructed, across the Rhine at Wessel, was more than 1,000 feet long and took 4 days to complete. German engineers, when questioned after the war, expressed a mix of admiration and incomprehension. One pioneer officer, interviewed by American historians in 1946, put it plainly, "You did not fight the war we prepared for. We built bridges to last forever. You built bridges to last a week, but you built so many that it did not matter. We could not destroy them faster than you could build them. In the end, that is why we lost." He was not entirely correct. Germany lost for many reasons, strategic, political, moral, but he was not entirely wrong either. The bridges were a microcosm of the larger war, a contest not just of armies, but of systems, of philosophies, of the capacity to absorb loss and continue forward. The Americans had mocked the Germans, too, in their own way, not with words, but with actions. They had answered German precision with American speed. They had met German craftsmanship with American mass production, and they had done so with a casualness that was, in its own way, devastating. The message was clear. We do not need to be better than you. We only need to be faster, and we need to have more.
The Roar River flows quietly now, through farmland and small towns that have long since forgotten the names of the men who died there. The bridges are gone, the Bailey spans dismantled after the war, the steel recycled, the pontoons deflated and shipped home. There are new bridges now, German bridges, permanent and elegant, built to last. But in the archives, in the war diaries and after-action reports, the memory remains, not of individual heroes, but of a system, a vast, grinding, relentless system that turned rivers into footnotes and obstacles into schedules. The men who built those bridges did not think of themselves as changing the world. They thought of themselves as doing a job, the same job they had done in factories and on farms before the war, the same job they would return to after. Yet in doing that job, they had spoken a truth that echoed far beyond the riverbanks of Germany. They had said, without words, that the world did not have to be the way it was, that destruction was not destiny, that a bridge could be built faster than it could be destroyed, and that this, more than any weapon or strategy, was the arithmetic of freedom. The Germans had believed that rivers were walls. The Americans proved that walls were temporary. And when the last Bailey Bridge came down and the last 6x6 truck rolled home, what remained was not the steel or the statistics, but the idea, the quiet revolutionary idea that nothing is permanent except the will to rebuild. That was the bridge that never fell.